Hey warrior! In 1971, a Navy pilot named James Stockdale watched his plane explode beneath him and parachuted into a country that would hold him as a prisoner for the next 7 years. He was beaten, starved, and isolated in a box smaller than most closets. Most men would have broken in the first month. Stockdale didn't. He later said the men who died first in that prison weren't the weakest. They were the optimists who kept telling themselves they'd be home by Christmas, then by Easter, then by Thanksgiving, until their hearts simply gave out from disappointment. The ones who survived were the ones who refused to lie to themselves about the present while still holding a quiet, stubborn belief that they would make it out in the end. That single distinction between false hope and real strength is the entire subject of this video. Compare that prison camp to something far more ordinary. A man loses his job on a Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday, he's already drafted 3 angry messages he never sent, replayed the meeting where he got the news a dozen times, and convinced himself the whole industry has turned against him personally. By Friday, he still hasn't updated his resume, because he spent the entire week defending his version of events to anyone who'll listen instead of building his next move. Nobody handed him a box smaller than a closet. He built one out of his own thinking, and he's been sitting inside it all week. There's a certain kind of person who walks through chaos without being shaped by it. You've met them, maybe you've envied them. They lose a job, and you don't see them panic. They get betrayed, and you don't see them beg for explanations. They face a diagnosis, a divorce, a public failure, and somehow they're still standing the next morning, doing the next right thing. People call this confidence. It isn't. It's something quieter and far more deliberate. It's a set of refusals. None of this is about pretending pain doesn't exist or wearing a mask of toughness over real wounds. Mentally unbreakable people aren't numb. They feel the full weight of disappointment, grief, and fear the same as anyone else. The difference shows up in what they refuse to let that feeling control afterward. Which decisions, which relationships, which version of themselves it's allowed to shape going forward. Mentally unbreakable people aren't built from what they do. They're built from what they will not do, no matter how much pressure life applies. While the rest of the world reacts, negotiates, and bends, they hold a private list of lines they don't cross. Not for applause, not for approval, not even for comfort. Today, we're going to walk through 10 of those refusals. Some of them will sting a little because you'll recognize exactly where you've been breaking them. Good. That sting is the beginning of armor. Most self-improvement content focuses on addition. Wake up earlier, read more books, drink more water, add another habit to a life that's already overloaded. There's nothing wrong with any of that, but it misses the deeper architecture of how unbreakable people actually operate. They aren't accumulating more rules to follow. They're subtracting weaknesses one at a time, the same way a sculptor doesn't add the statue. He removes everything that isn't the statue until what's left can't be anything else. This video isn't about becoming someone new. It's about removing the 10 small surrenders that keep most people fragile without their even realizing it. Each one on its own seems harmless. Stacked together across years, they're the difference between a person who bends under the first real storm and a person who's already weathered 100 smaller ones by the time the big storm arrives. Before we go further, tell me in the comments which number hits hardest by the end of this video. That single comment helps this message reach someone who needs to hear it today. Now let's get into it. If you're with me on this, type "my mind, my rules" right now before you keep watching. Rule 1. They refuse to explain themselves. Silence is not guilt. There's a strange trap that catches almost everyone at some point. The belief that every accusation deserves a defense, that every raised eyebrow needs a paragraph of context, that staying quiet when someone misjudges you is the same as admitting they're right. Mentally unbreakable people have quietly escaped this trap, and it's one of the most freeing decisions a person can make. Epictetus, a former slave who became one of Rome's most respected philosophers, taught his students something most people never learn: Other people's opinions of you are not your business. He put it directly. If someone speaks badly of you, examine whether the criticism is true. If it is, correct yourself. If it isn't, remember the words weren't actually about you at all. They were about the person who said them. Epictetus said, "If someone speaks badly of you, the words were never really about you. They were about him." Watch how much energy the average person spends defending their choices to relatives who weren't asked, co-workers who weren't involved, and strangers online who will forget the conversation by tomorrow. Every explanation offered to an unearned audience is a withdrawal from a bank account that should be funding your actual life. The strong don't owe a transcript of their reasoning to every person who raises a question. They owe it to the people who matter, and only when it's actually useful. This doesn't mean becoming cold or refusing accountability. It means recognizing the difference between someone who deserves an answer and someone who simply wants a reaction. A business partner deserves an explanation. A parent worried about your well-being deserves an explanation. A stranger with an opinion about a decision that doesn't touch their life deserves nothing but your peace. Marcus Aurelius wrote something his soldiers carried into battle without realizing it would be read 2,000 years later, that it's not necessary to think someone has insulted you for the insult to land. Most of what wounds us is permission we hand out for free. There's a practical reason this matters beyond peace of mind. Every minute spent crafting a justification for a choice you've already made is a minute stolen from actually living that choice. Energy is finite. Attention is finite. A person who spends both defending decisions to an audience that has no stake in the outcome will always have less left over for the people and goals that actually deserve it. The strong learn to ration their explanations the same way they ration their money, carefully, and only toward things that yield a return. If you've spent years over-explaining yourself to people who never earned the right to ask, this is your moment to stop the leak. Notice the physical sensation the next time you feel the urge to justify a choice nobody actually challenged. It usually starts as a tightening somewhere in the chest, a need to fill the air before someone forms a negative opinion of you. That sensation is the old habit, asking to be fed. You don't have to feed it. You can simply notice it, let it pass, and say nothing at all. There's also a quieter benefit to this refusal that rarely gets discussed. The people who respect you most will respect you more, not less, for not chasing every comment for clarification. Constant explanation can actually look like insecurity to the very people whose opinion you'd want to keep. Restraint, paradoxically, signals more security than any paragraph of justification ever could. Comment, "I owe no explanation," if you're done justifying yourself to people who never earned the right to ask. Rule 2. They refuse to compete for approval. Respect is earned, not auditioned for. There's a quiet exhaustion that comes from spending your life trying out for a part nobody offered you. Chasing approval is exactly that audition, an endless performance for judges who never agreed to evaluate you in the first place. Friedrich Nietzsche warned against this trap with unusual force. He argued that the man who needs constant validation has handed his own worth to the crowd, and the crowd is fickle, easily bored, and rarely loyal. A person built on applause collapses the moment the applause stops. Friedrich Nietzsche said, "Whoever needs the crowd's applause has already handed the crowd his own worth." Watch what happens to people who base their identity on being liked. They soften their opinions in meetings. They say yes to plans they hate. They laugh at jokes that aren't funny. Over time, they become a composite of everyone else's preferences, with almost nothing left that's actually theirs. The cost of approval isn't small. It's the slow erosion of an entire personality. Carl Jung described something he called the persona, the mask we build to be accepted by the people around us. He warned that if a person identifies too completely with that mask, they lose contact with who they actually are underneath it. The unbreakable mind keeps the mask thin. It uses charm and tact when useful, but never mistakes the mask for the face. This refusal isn't arrogance. Arrogance still needs an audience. This is something closer to indifference, a genuine, settled lack of interest in being everyone's favorite. The strong would rather be respected by 5 people who actually know them than liked by 500 who don't. There's a useful test for spotting how much of your own behavior is approval-driven. Ask yourself whether you'd still make the same choice if nobody ever found out you made it. If the honest answer changes depending on who's watching, some part of that decision belongs to the audience, not to you. The unbreakable mind keeps shrinking that gap until almost nothing they do depends on being seen. Think about the last time you changed your real opinion just to keep the room comfortable. That moment cost you more than you realized. It's worth asking where this habit actually started, because almost nobody arrives at approval seeking by accident. Most people learned somewhere early in life that being agreeable kept the peace, kept the praise coming, kept them safe from disappointing someone whose opinion mattered enormously at the time. That strategy may have made sense once. It rarely still does, and the unbreakable mind eventually outgrows the old strategy instead of dragging it into every room for the rest of their life. There's a noticeable shift that happens once someone stops competing for approval. Conversations get shorter and more honest. Decisions get made faster because there's no longer a committee of imagined critics being consulted before every choice. People around you may even respect you more, oddly enough, because a person who clearly doesn't need the room's approval is far more interesting than one who's visibly performing for it. Type, "I'm not auditioning" below if you just realized how long you've been performing for an audience that never asked you to. Rule 3. They refuse to let comfort make their decisions. Ease is not a compass. Comfort feels like safety. It rarely is. It's usually just the absence of growth disguised as peace, and mentally unbreakable people learned a long time ago not to trust that disguise. Seneca, who advised an emperor and amassed enormous wealth, wrote candidly about how dangerous comfort actually is. He said that prosperity tests a person far more severely than hardship, because hardship forces vigilance while comfort lulls a person into believing nothing will ever change. He trained himself deliberately, sleeping on hard floors some nights, eating simple food on others, not out of poverty, but to make sure comfort never became the only condition under which he could function. Seneca said, "Prosperity tests a person far more severely than hardship because comfort never warns you before it weakens you." Most people make their biggest decisions by asking a single quiet question: which option feels easiest right now? They stay in the job that drains them because leaving feels harder than staying. They avoid the conversation that could fix the relationship because the silence, however painful, is familiar. Comfort has a gravity to it, and that gravity pulls people towards stagnation, disguised as stability. The unbreakable mind asks a different question before every major decision. Which option actually serves who I'm trying to become? Sometimes the answer is the harder one, the cold plunge, the difficult conversation, the unfamiliar city, the new skill that makes you feel like a beginner again. Growth and comfort rarely point in the same direction, and when forced to choose, the strong choose growth almost every time. This is partly why so many people stay stuck in lives that quietly bore them. Boredom is uncomfortable, but it's a familiar discomfort, and familiar discomfort will always feel safer than unfamiliar possibility, even when the possibility is objectively better. The mind defaults to the known quantity unless something forces it to consider the unknown one. Unbreakable people learn to be that forcing function for themselves, instead of waiting for a crisis to do it for them. This isn't about glorifying suffering for its own sake. It's about refusing to let the path of least resistance quietly write the story of your entire life. Picture 2 versions of the same 5 years. In one, comfort wins every close decision, and the person ends up exactly where they started, just older. In the other, growth wins most of the close decisions, and the person is almost unrecognizable by the end, not because any single choice was dramatic, but because the compounding of small, slightly harder choices adds up to an entirely different trajectory. The 5 years pass either way. The only real variable is which voice you listened to each time the two options were close. Seneca's deliberate practice of occasional hardship has a modern equivalent that anyone can adopt without sleeping on a floor. Take a cold shower on a morning you'd rather skip it. Have the conversation you've been postponing for a month. Say no to a plan that's comfortable but pointless. These aren't grand gestures. They're small reminders to your own nervous system that you can tolerate discomfort on purpose, which makes the discomfort that arrives uninvited far less frightening when it eventually does. Drop "I choose growth" in the comments if you're ready to stop letting comfort make your decisions for you. Rule 4. They refuse to drag yesterday into today. The past doesn't get a vote. There's a particular kind of weight that has nothing to do with what's actually happening right now, and everything to do with what already happened. Mentally unbreakable people have learned to set that weight down at the door every single morning, no matter how heavy it was the day before. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire while burying children, fighting wars and surviving plagues, yet his private journal reads almost nothing like a man drowning in his history. He reminded himself constantly that the only moment that actually exists is the one happening right now. The past is gone, unreachable, and the future hasn't arrived to be controlled. Spending today's energy refighting yesterday's battle is a transaction with no possible return. Marcus Aurelius said, "Confine yourself to the present. Yesterday and tomorrow hold no power over you unless you hand it to them." This is harder than it sounds, because the mind loves to replay. It loves to rehearse the argument you should have won, the apology you never got, the version of events where you come out looking better. Every replay feels productive in the moment and costs you in reality, because the only thing that replay accomplishes is keeping yesterday's wound fresh enough to bleed into today. Psychologists call this rumination, and research consistently links it to anxiety and depression, not resolution. The mind mistakes repetition for progress. It isn't progress. It's a loop with no exit, and the only way out is a decision, not a feeling. The decision to close the file on something even when it isn't fully resolved, because carrying it any further is costing you more than closure ever could. There's a difference between processing and replaying that's easy to miss from the inside. Processing has an end point. It moves toward understanding and then stops. Replaying has no end point because it isn't actually trying to understand anything. It's just circling the same pain, looking for an exit that thinking alone will never produce. The unbreakable mind notices when a thought has stopped producing insight and started producing only discomfort, and that's the signal to deliberately change the channel. This doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen or skipping the lessons buried inside it. Extract the lesson, then release the weight. Carry the wisdom, leave the wound. A useful image here is a backpack. Every unresolved grudge, every unfinished argument, every old humiliation you keep replaying is another stone added to that pack, and you carry it everywhere whether you notice the weight or not. At some point, the question isn't whether the stone was fair to receive. It's whether you're willing to keep hauling it up every hill for the rest of your life, simply because someone handed it to you once, years ago. There's a specific moment worth watching for, the instant a memory surfaces uninvited during an ordinary task, pulling your attention out of the present and back into something that already finished. That moment is a choice point, even though it rarely feels like one. You can follow the memory down into the old argument again, or you can name it quietly as the past, doing what the past does, and return your attention to whatever's actually in front of you right now. If there's a stone you're finally ready to set down, comment, "I'm putting it down," and mean it. Rule 5. They refuse to perform confidence they haven't built. Real strength doesn't need an audience. Somewhere along the way, confidence became a costume. People learned to stand taller in photos, speak louder in meetings, and post captions about self-belief while privately falling apart the moment nobody's watching. Mentally unbreakable people walked away from that performance entirely because they understood something most people never stop to consider. Confidence you perform for others is not the same thing as confidence you've actually built. Niccolo Machiavelli, writing centuries before social media existed, understood the gap between appearance and substance better than almost anyone. He noted that a ruler's reputation matters enormously, but warned that a reputation built on nothing but appearance collapses the moment reality tests it. Substance has to exist underneath the image, or the image becomes a liability the second pressure arrives. Niccolo Machiavelli said, "A reputation built on appearance alone collapses the moment reality is allowed to test it." The strong build their actual confidence in places nobody is filming. It's built in the gym session nobody applauded. It's built in the difficult skill practiced alone for months before anyone noticed improvement. It's built in the version of you that kept a promise to yourself when breaking it would have been easier and nobody would have known. Real confidence isn't loud. It doesn't need a caption. It shows up quietly in how a person handles the moment everything goes wrong, because that's the only test that actually matters. Watch the people who talk the most about how unshakable they are. Often, the talking is the tell. The genuinely unbreakable rarely announce it, because they're too busy proving it to themselves in private to need anyone else's validation of the fact. There's an old distinction worth keeping in mind here. Confidence is not the absence of doubt, it's the presence of evidence. Every rep completed, every hard conversation survived, every promise kept becomes a small piece of proof your own mind can reference later under pressure. Borrowed confidence, the kind built on a good outfit, a clever caption, or a temporary mood, has no evidence behind it, which is exactly why it evaporates the moment something real tests it. If you've been performing a strength you haven't actually built yet, that's not shameful. It's just information. Use it. Go build the real thing in private starting today and let your results speak when they're ready. There's a strange relief in giving up the performance once you notice how exhausting it's been to maintain. Pretending takes constant maintenance. A story to keep consistent, an image to keep polished, a gap between the public version of you and the private one that has to be managed every single day. Building the real thing takes effort too, but it's a different kind of tired. It's the tired of actually getting somewhere instead of the tired of holding up a version of yourself that was never quite true. Machiavelli wasn't wrong that perception matters in a world full of people who judge quickly and rarely look closer. But he was equally clear that perception without substance is fragile, a structure with nothing holding it up the moment weather arrives. The unbreakable mind builds the structure first, then lets the perception follow naturally from something that's actually load-bearing. Type, "I build in silence" if you're done performing confidence you haven't actually built yet. Rule 6. They refuse to bargain with their own discipline. A promise to yourself is still a promise. There's a specific kind of self-betrayal that almost never gets named, because it happens in private and feels harmless every single time it occurs. It's the moment you make a deal with yourself to skip the workout, push the deadline, or sleep through the early start, and you tell yourself it's just this once. Mentally unbreakable people have learned that just this once is rarely true, and the cost of breaking a promise to yourself is invisible until it isn't. The Stoics called the practice of holding firm to your own standards the discipline of action. Epictetus argued that virtue isn't theoretical. It's proven only in the moment you're tempted to abandon it. A person who keeps their word when it's easy hasn't proven anything yet. The proof comes in the moment keeping the word is inconvenient, uncomfortable, or invisible to everyone but you. Epictetus said, "First decide who you intend to be. Then Act like that person without exception, even when no one is watching. Every broken promise to yourself teaches your own mind a quiet lesson, that your word is negotiable under pressure. Do these enough times and you create a person who can't actually trust themselves, which is far more dangerous than not being trusted by others. Self-trust is the foundation everything else stands on. Lose it, and even your biggest wins feel hollow, because some part of you knows you're not entirely reliable. This is why discipline and self-respect are so tightly linked, even though people rarely talk about them in the same sentence. Respect for yourself isn't built through compliments you give yourself in the mirror. It's built through a track record only you can see. The early alarm you actually answered, the difficult call you actually made, the version of you who showed up when showing up wasn't required by anyone but yourself. The fix isn't dramatic. It's small, boring and repeated. Set a standard low enough to actually keep, then keep it without negotiation every single day until your own brain stops testing you to see if you mean it. Discipline isn't built through one heroic effort. It's built through 1,000 unremarkable moments where you simply did the smaller, harder thing you said you'd do. Think of discipline less like a personality trait and more like a muscle that atrophies the moment you stop using it honestly. Every time you keep a small promise nobody else would have noticed if you broke, that muscle gets a little stronger. Every time you skip it quietly, telling yourself it doesn't really count this time, the muscle weakens a little, and the next excuse becomes slightly easier to accept than the last one. The most reliable people you know almost certainly aren't relying on motivation to get things done. They built a system of small, repeatable commitments long before motivation became a factor, and now the commitment runs on momentum rather than mood. That's the actual target worth aiming for, not feeling endlessly inspired, but becoming someone whose word holds regardless of how inspired they happen to feel on any particular morning. Comment, "I don't bargain" if you're finished negotiating with promises you made to no one but yourself. Rule 7. They refuse to borrow other people's urgency. Your pace belongs to you. Somebody else's emergency is not automatically yours. This sounds obvious, yet most people spend enormous portions of their lives absorbing other people's panic as if it were their own personal crisis, dropping their own priorities the moment someone else raises their voice or rushes toward them with a problem. Epictetus drew a sharp line between what belongs to you and what doesn't. Your judgments, your effort, your choices, those are yours. Other people's moods, deadlines manufactured by their own poor planning, and chaos they generated through their own choices are not yours to inherit just because they handed it to you with urgency in their voice. Watch how quickly an entire office can be hijacked by one person's last-minute crisis, dropping every actual priority to scramble around a fire someone else started weeks ago through their own avoidance. The unbreakable mind can help without absorbing. They can offer support without letting someone else's emergency override their own carefully built schedule and priorities. This requires a kind of calm most people never develop because urgency is contagious by design. A racing voice triggers a racing nervous system in everyone nearby. Learning to receive someone's panic without catching it is a skill, not a personality trait, and it can be trained the same way any other skill is trained, through repetition and deliberate practice. There's a particular kind of person who manufactures urgency as a habit, usually because their own lack of planning becomes everyone else's deadline. Mentally unbreakable people learn to recognize this pattern quickly. They'll still help where help is genuinely warranted, but they stop letting other people's poor time management override their own carefully built priorities on a recurring basis. Helping once is generosity. Helping every time someone else fails to plan is a slow erosion of your own agenda. The next time someone tries to hand you their urgency, pause before you pick it up. Ask whether this actually requires your immediate attention or whether it simply requires their immediate emotion. Often, the two get confused, and only one of them is actually yours to carry. A simple way to test this in the moment is to ask what would actually happen if you responded an hour from now instead of right now. If the honest answer is nothing meaningful would change, then the urgency was performance, not necessity, and you're free to finish what you were already doing before you address it. Boundaries like this often feel selfish the first few times you set them, mostly because the people benefiting from your constant availability will tell you, directly or indirectly, that something has changed about you. Something has. You stopped being a free emergency line for problems that were never actually yours, and that adjustment, however uncomfortable at first, is what protects the time and energy you need for the priorities that are genuinely yours to carry. Rule 8. They refuse to confuse silence with surrender. Stillness can be a weapon. In a world that rewards the loudest reaction, the person who stays quiet under pressure is often mistaken for someone who's lost. Mentally unbreakable people know better. They understand that silence, used deliberately, is one of the most powerful tools available, and they refuse to fill every uncomfortable gap with noise just to relieve their own tension. Sun Tzu, writing about strategy long before modern psychology existed, observed that the supreme outcome in any conflict is winning without ever needing to fight at all. Stillness in this sense isn't passivity. It's the discipline of not reacting until reaction actually serves a purpose, rather than reacting simply because staying quiet feels unbearable. Carl Jung said, "In all chaos there is a hidden order. Silence is where a steady mind learns to find it." Most people speak too quickly under pressure. They fill silence with justifications, jokes, or apologies nobody asked for, simply because the quiet itself feels like exposure. But silence forces the other side to reveal more of their actual position. It removes ammunition from people who are hoping for an emotional reaction they can use against you. A calm, unreadable response is far harder to attack than a defensive, hurried one. Carl Jung wrote about the value of solitude and inner stillness as a place where a person reconnects with parts of themselves that constant noise drowns out. The unbreakable mind treats silence not as something to escape, but as a place to think clearly before choosing the next move. There's also a strategic advantage hiding inside stillness that most people overlook entirely. A person who reacts instantly gives away exactly where their pressure points are. A person who pauses gives nothing away. In negotiations, conflicts, and even ordinary disagreements, the first person to fill the silence usually reveals the most information, and information is leverage. The strong understand this instinctively, even when they've never studied negotiation a single day in their life. This doesn't mean going silent on people who deserve a real answer or weaponizing the cold shoulder as punishment. It means refusing to let discomfort force you into a reaction before you're actually ready to give one. Practice this in low-stakes moments first, because the skill transfers. The next time you receive a frustrating message, wait 1 full hour before replying. Even if the reply you'd planned to send within the first 5 minutes feels perfectly reasonable in the moment, read it again after the hour passes. Almost every time, the version of you who waited writes something calmer, sharper, and far harder to use against you than the version who reacted instantly. Sun Tzu's broader point still holds across nearly every kind of conflict, from a boardroom disagreement to a family argument at a holiday dinner. The person trying hardest to provoke a reaction is usually the one most desperate for that reaction, because it confirms something they need to believe. Withholding the reaction they're fishing for, calmly and without drama, is often the single most disarming response available, far more effective than any clever comeback could ever be. Type "I choose stillness" below if you're tired of reacting before you're ready to. Rule 9. They refuse to let one failure write the whole story. A chapter is not the book. A single bad outcome convinces almost everyone at some point that they've discovered the truth about themselves, that they're simply not capable, not talented enough, not built for whatever they were attempting. Mentally unbreakable people have learned to catch that thought before it calcifies into identity, because a failure is data, not a verdict. Seneca lost his fortune, was exiled, and was eventually forced to take his own life by the very emperor he once tutored. Yet his writings, the ones that survived 2,000 years, read like the work of a man who never let any single event define his worth. He treated setbacks as material to study rather than evidence to accept. Every failure contained information about what to adjust, never proof of who he fundamentally was. Seneca said, "Difficulties strengthen the mind, the same way labor strengthens the body." The danger with failure isn't the event itself, it's the story a person attaches to it afterward. "I lost the deal" is a fact. "I'm bad at this and always will be" is a story, and stories like that tend to become self-fulfilling the moment they're accepted as truth. The unbreakable mind separates the two automatically. They examine the fact, extract whatever lesson is actually there, and refuse to let their imagination write a permanent character flaw out of one temporary outcome. This separation takes practice, especially because the mind is wired to generalize from pain quickly. It's a survival mechanism that once helped humans avoid repeated danger, but in modern life it often overcorrects, turning one rejection into a belief that rejection is simply your permanent condition. There's a quiet exercise that helps break this pattern. After any setback, write down the bare fact of what happened in one plain sentence, with no adjectives and no judgment attached. Then write a second sentence describing only what you'll adjust next time. Nothing else gets added. This forces the event back into the category of information before the mind has a chance to dress it up as a verdict about your entire character. It's a small habit, but it interrupts the spiral before it gathers speed. Some of the most accomplished people in any field have failure counts that would shock the average person who only sees the finished result. The difference was never the absence of failure. It was the refusal to let any single instance of it become the final word on their ability, when it was only ever meant to be one data point among hundreds still being collected. There's a reason this refusal matters more than almost any other on this list. A person who lets one failure become a verdict stops trying new things, because trying invites the risk of more verdicts. A person who treats failure as data keeps experimenting, keeps adjusting, and over enough attempts simply outlasts everyone who quit early out of fear of what one more bad result might supposedly prove about them. Comment, "I write the next chapter," if you're done letting one failure write the whole story. Rule 10. They refuse to wait for permission to begin. Readiness is a myth. Almost nobody feels ready before they start the thing that matters. Mentally unbreakable people start anyway, because they've stopped believing that a feeling of readiness is a prerequisite for action. It's simply something that shows up later, usually somewhere in the middle of doing the work, never before it. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself about rising in the morning to do the work of a human being, regardless of how unwilling or unready he felt in that particular moment. He didn't wait for inspiration or confidence to arrive before beginning his obligations. He treated the feeling of reluctance as irrelevant information, separate entirely from the decision to act. Marcus Aurelius said, "Waste no more time arguing what a good person should be one." Most people are waiting for a sign that will never come. The perfect amount of confidence, the ideal conditions, the moment when fear finally disappears entirely. That moment isn't coming because fear and uncertainty are part of doing anything that actually matters. The people who build extraordinary lives didn't wait for the fear to leave. They simply decided the goal mattered more than the discomfort of starting without a guarantee. There's a reason readiness keeps slipping further away the longer someone waits for it. Confidence is built through action, not before it. You can't think your way into feeling ready for something you've never attempted. The feeling arrives somewhere around the 5th or 15th attempt, built from actual evidence, not from waiting quietly for the nerves to calm down on their own. The unbreakable mind starts uncomfortable on purpose because comfort was never going to arrive first. There's a small, deliberate practice worth borrowing from people who consistently start before they feel ready. Shrink the first step until it's almost embarrassingly small, then take it immediately before the mind has time to talk you out of it. Not the whole project, not the whole conversation, not the whole transformation, just the first 5 minutes of it today, while the resolve is still warm. This refusal to wait is perhaps the most practical of all 10, because it's the one that turns every other principle on this list into something real. You can refuse to explain yourself, refuse to chase approval, refuse to let comfort decide, refuse to carry yesterday's weight, and none of it matters if you never actually begin the thing you're protecting all that energy for. Permission was never coming from anyone else. It was always yours to give yourself the moment you decided to stop waiting for someone or something else to hand it to you. A year from now, 2 outcomes are possible. Either you started today, or you kept waiting for a feeling that was never going to arrive on schedule. The gap between those 2 outcomes isn't talent or luck. It's a single decision, made today, to move before everything feels lined up perfectly. Because it almost never does, for anyone, and the ones who built something real simply stopped waiting for it to. Last one, type "I start today" and go take the first 5 minutes before this video even finishes loading. 10 refusals, not 10 techniques, not 10 hacks, not 10 quotes to repeat until they lose meaning. 10 deliberate decisions about what you will no longer allow into your daily operating system. Explaining yourself to people who didn't earn it, competing for approval that was never guaranteed to begin with, letting comfort steer decisions meant for growth, dragging yesterday into a today that deserves a clean start, performing a confidence you haven't actually built yet, negotiating with promises you made to no one but yourself, absorbing urgency that was never yours to carry, mistaking necessary silence for surrender, letting one failure write a permanent verdict, waiting for a permission that nobody was ever going to hand you. None of this happens overnight, and none of it requires perfection. Stockdale didn't survive 7 years of captivity because he mastered every principle on day 1. He survived because he kept choosing the harder, quieter truth over the easier illusion, day after day, until the choosing became who he was. That's the entire blueprint. Not perfection, repetition aimed in the right direction, for long enough that it stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like identity. Notice something about every refusal on this list. None of them require money, talent, connections, or luck. They require a decision, repeated until it hardens into a default setting. That's what makes this list so quietly powerful. It's available to absolutely anyone willing to start practicing it today, regardless of where they're starting from or what's already happened in their life up to this point. It's worth saying plainly that becoming unbreakable doesn't mean becoming unfeeling. The people who embody these 10 refusals still grieve, still get frustrated, still feel the sting of rejection like anyone else. What changes isn't the presence of difficult emotion. It's what happens next. They feel it fully, then they choose their next action deliberately instead of letting the feeling choose it for them. That's the entire difference between someone who's fragile and someone who simply looks calm because they've already done the work nobody saw. If you only remember one thing from the next 24 hours, remember this. Nobody is coming to hand you an unbreakable mind fully built. It gets assembled the same way Stockdale's survival got assembled. One refusal, repeated under pressure, until the refusal stops requiring effort and simply becomes who you are. You don't need to adopt all 10 refusals today. Pick the one that stung the most while you were listening. That's usually the one your life is asking you to work on first. Build that one refusal into a habit, then move to the next, and watch how much of your old reactivity quietly disappears without you ever needing to announce the change to anyone. If this reached you at the right moment, hit that like button, comments, and share it with the one person in your life who needs to read this exact list today. Subscribe if you want more of this. And remember, the mind that refuses the right things ends up free to build everything else.